Okay, good evening, everybody. I think we can start. More people are trickling in, but I think we are already a good number. Welcome to this webinar organized together by M&M, Idee per un Paese Migliore, and Reuters Breakingviews. It's a two-part webinar. The first one is devoted, let's be simple, to the economy and the future of the economy. And the second one is an interview by Rob Cox on the future of cities. As you know, for those who are not members and for those who haven't heard about it, just a couple of words about M&M, Idee per il Paese Migliore, is just an association created more or less a year ago, which brings together people with different backgrounds, different professions, and also different political orientation, to discuss public policies and issues of res publica. The association has been very busy, somehow thanks, unfortunately, to the pandemic, also in making policy proposals for the government in the area of how to ensure liquidity to business, how to recapitalize companies, the health system, the use of the ESM, and more recently, of course, the Next Generation EU and the national plan on recovery and resilience. Let me say that, today is somehow is a very topical day for a couple of issues. One, of course, is the Italian political situation. For our foreign friends who haven't been following Italian politics, by the hour, we have the resignation of the Conte government, and we are in what we call crisi politica. The other topic is more less general, but it's relevant for our seminar tonight, is that as far as I understand, they are in the process of, from what I understand from media, they are in the process of choosing the next CEO of a very important Italian bank. So one of the speakers is somehow busy in this process. Is not certain he will join us. I refer, of course, to Piercarlo Padoan, who's in the board of the bank. Without very much further ado, I will start with the first session of the webinar, which is devoted indeed to comment the first two chapters of a publication. I would define a classic publication, because it's going on annually since a while, which is the Reuters Breakingviews, and particularly the first two chapters. The first one has been written by Swaha Patanik, and the second one by Peter Tal Larsen. The first one is devoted to what is the ideal economy, how to build what she calls the Frankenstein economy in the positive sense. And the second one is on the role of government after the pandemic. Not much to add. I will leave the floor to Swaha and Peter, and then we will have the two very authoritative panelists to comment. Guntram Wolff, director of Bruegel. Guntram doesn't need an introduction, and Silvia Merler from Algebris. We are in the best hands. If there are, after that, we will open for Q&A, either directly or through the chat, as you prefer. If you prefer to have the floor, the only thing I will ask you is to be very, to introduce yourself and be very concise. If you prefer to do it through the chat, I can pass the questions to the author of the chapters, or to the panelists, or both, whatever your intentions are. Swaha, the floor
Thank you very much,
is yours.
Fabrizio. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. And I'm almost looking more, I'm looking forward more to Guntram and the other commentators than this bit. So we'll get speedily on. So my piece about the Franken economy, as Fabrizio says, is a sort of thought experiment about the sort of economy that could come through the pandemic and thrive in post-pandemic world terms. And what sort of factors you'd need in an economy. It's less a monster than a utopia, as I say. There are several basics. Fabrizio is alluding at some of the politics that's going on that I'm taking for granted. And we've seen this on the other side of the Atlantic about strong institutions, transparency, accountability of government. But let's put that aside and focus on the economics, which is what we're here for. So one of the first sort of thought experiment ideas I had was, whatever happens, we have changed the way we work, live and consume forever. We're not going back to 2019, much as we'd all like to go back to restaurants and stuff, and we will. The way we work, definitely gathered here as we are today, it's going to rely a lot on information communication technology. So those who are the leaders in that, South Korea, for example, which exports nearly 28% of its total exports are ICT, that's who you want to emulate in the post-COVID world. Also, you'll have the best in class rolling out 4G and 5G. My connection's holding up, but Britain definitely won't make utopia as a model on this basis. The other things that one would look for is productivity, so embracing automation, doing something about education to help not just the low-skilled workers, but the swathes of the middle class who will be ousted by machines. I speak as much for journalists. You can do sort of passing of stock market news releases and get a computer to write a basic news report. So I speak as much for middle class and what used to be knowledge economy workers as anybody else. So you've got people like Switzerland who are absolute world leaders in equipping their workers with the skills they need. We also need to think about trading partners. Trading with China is always a huge advantage at the moment because they manage their economy so much more closely. And like we've seen with Japanese trade data recently, you do a lot better if you're exporting to China, which has a healthy growth rate. Finally, from my point of view, the green economy will be important. Green tech leaders like Denmark will do well and won't have a cliff edge to look out for. I'll finish there and hand over to my colleague Peter Tal Larsen at my 2 minutes for the next piece on the chapter, the following chapter.
Peter.
Let me just unmute myself here. Okay. Thanks very much, Swaha. And thank you, Fabrizio, for the invitation. So basically, the piece that I wrote for this set of predictions is about the new phenomenon of the state as an activist investor. I think we're all familiar with states getting involved in acquisitions and in corporate management. We've obviously had over the years, the French government blocking Pepsi from buying Danone. We've had the US aggressively reviewing foreign investments. We've seen also, the rise of China and state-owned companies in China. In fact, I think at the beginning of this century, 5% of state-owned enterprises, or 5% of the state-owned enterprises owned 5% of the assets of the world's 2,000 largest companies. And by 2018, so just a couple of years ago, that was 20%. And I'm sure that in the last year or so, that proportion has increased. I think like so many things that we talk about, the pandemic has really accelerated some of these trends we're seeing. And so part of this has come through necessity. Governments have had to inject cash into ailing companies, sometimes in the form of equity, sometimes in the form of hybrid debt, sometimes with guaranteed loans. But it seems fairly certain that particularly as some of these companies run into more trouble, that debt will be converted into equity and governments will find themselves the unwilling owners of equity in large companies. So we're going to see an increase in state investment that way. But states have also become more proactive really during the pandemic. So, and we've just seen in the last few months, the German government has adopted a fairly aggressive review of foreign investments. The UK, traditionally one of the more open, laissez-faire economies, has also introduced a foreign investment law, which basically means that people are going to have to go and lobby the government to get their deals approved. And then, and that's sort of on the negative side, the blocking deals side. But at the same time, also what we're seeing is governments becoming more aggressive. Now, in Italy, maybe people are a bit more used to this, and CDP has been, again, sort of even more active than in the past, buying stakes in companies like Euronext and Nexi, really trying to place some bets about companies that are going to be big players in the future. But we're also seeing this in other countries now. We've seen it in Germany, where they were investing in vaccine makers. We've seen it in the UK, where they spent 500 million British pounds to buy a stake in a bankrupt satellite maker. This is something that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago. So I think really the expectation is that this is going to continue. The pandemic has increased the role of government across society, and I think we're going to see governments more active, both as investors in companies, and then the question will become, how do they manage those investments? Do they run them with proper governance? Do they separate them? Do they manage them at arm's length and think about getting value for taxpayers? Or do they start meddling in those businesses in the way that they did back in the 1970s? And then the other question really is on the sort of on the more defensive side. How do these new sort of investment review type processes play out? But I think one thing that is absolutely clear is that if you're a company or an investor, a private investor, or an advisor to companies or private investors, the role of the government, the position of the government looms much larger and will continue to loom much larger now than it did just a few years ago. Thank you.
Well, I restrain myself. I would like to comment, but I don't want to take any time. Guntram, please, you're on.
Well, thanks a lot, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks a lot for having me, and thank you for this overview. I mean, it's a very big and broad topic, obviously, that we are discussing here. So what I thought I would do is I would start discussing a bit the I guess the current situation, and then think a little bit about sort of the way forward, right? And I think the current situation is certainly one where the one determining factor for our economic performance is really our health performance. So in other words, if we don't fix the pandemic, we will not get back to the 100% economy we would like to go back to, right? So so this is really, I think, the policy issue, the number one policy issue that we all need to think about and that we really need to address. Having said that, I think in that space, the debate is very, very active, as you know, currently, and we know that the contract tracing strategy is not sufficient. We know that it's not sufficient what we have developed in the digital space with tracking devices on our smartphones and the like. And I do think there is some need to review also what we can do very specifically with digital technologies and how we balance fundamental rights in that space. I mean, it is quite striking that we value privacy when it comes to apps more highly than we value our freedom to go out and have a beer in a bar. So I think that's a conversation I think we need to have, because the vaccine is, of course, the other big thing which has to happen. And on the vaccine, we are quite slow in the Eurozone and in the EU at the moment. And we are quite slow essentially because of supply constraints. I mean, the vaccine is not available. I mean, we have seen differences in inoculation capacity across EU countries that were quite striking in the first weeks of this year. But by now, the best performers have had to cut dramatically their inoculation, basically because vaccines are not available. And that's really, I mean, for example, Denmark has been doing very well and is now really constrained. Now, when it comes to, and I need to, this phone is, I can't switch this phone off, sorry. This is, I take out the battery, that's the best way. And so, sorry, and I guess so that's the vaccine story, and I think really the supply constraint needs to be addressed as urgently and as quickly as possible. Now, here I do think at the moment the Commission is on the right track. Actually, I mean it puts a lot of pressure now on the pharma companies, especially those that seem to have broken their contractual arrangements, and there I think the AstraZeneca case is going to be very, very important, and we will have to look at this very carefully. But it seems to me that the delay in the deliveries, even though pre-financing was done, is really unacceptable. So I really think the focus now needs to be on that. Now, having said that, I think the report and the bulk of the report is really more about sort of the medium and long-term transition and of our economies. And there, I think the big trends, I basically agree with those. It's digitalization, it's of course the rise of China, it's of course climate, and of course it's also the role of the state in our economies. And I guess the one point that I would perhaps add and highlight a bit at this stage is really how the future of work and how our approach to work will change and is changing. And perhaps there can be some optimism in the sense that this pandemic has, in a very, very short time, driven us into a very, very different world. Now, I'm not saying that I really like that world. I have to say it would be much more fun to discuss with all of you now in a room and then have a proper Italian dinner. But it is also incredibly efficient, and we have to admit that. I mean, this kind of conversation, I can literally have 3 or 4 of these kind of conversations in 4 different continents of the world on a single day. So it is much more efficient, but it's also less pleasant. And I do think we need to sort of find the right balance between these two going forward. It's not just about the technical capacities. I think the technical capacities we have accelerated drastically and moved upwards dramatically. But now really what we have to find is a new balance, a new equilibrium also in the workplace. So once we can travel again, once we can meet again, we have to really, I think, find the right balance, because productivity on the one hand is much more efficient, is going up. On the other hand, I think there are issues about creativity at the workplace. There are issues about the lack of interactions, meaning lack of physical interactions, meaning less creativity potentially. So these things will have to be investigated, and I think the organization of the workplace is one fascinating topic on which I would definitely think more research would be extremely welcome. Now, we could talk about many other issues, and I don't want to crowd out Silvia. Also, I'm sure she will want to talk perhaps about some fiscal policy issues, and I think there is also, of course, a need to review our fiscal policy strategy, but perhaps we keep that for later or for Silvia. Thank you.
Silvia, you have the floor. Today was the fiscal policy day after the comment by the chief of staff of Mrs. Merkel.
Yeah, I'm not nearly as professional as Guntram. I don't have any banner, and I'm also amazed at the fact that Guntram has a phone where you can still take the battery out. This is something. Speaking of digitalization, coming to the report. Sorry.
It's not a smartphone. It's my normal, handset for the.
Yeah, that is what is amazing to me. But I know I can joke with Guntram. Guntram used to be my boss at Bruegel, so I know I can afford doing this. Coming to the report, I really found that these 2 chapters were actually working really well together, because chapter 1, so this Franken economy monster or utopia that we just talked about, sort of implicitly relies on, I think, a key question, the answer to which is really relevant to how we perceive the role of the state in terms of as an investor. And the key question is, and Guntram sort of hinted at that previously, really how much of the output loss that we are experiencing is going to be permanent. So what is the potential that we are actually going back to or have to rebuild in a way? And I think until summer 2020, probably most analysts and commentators would have agreed that the permanent damage would be relatively moderate to the economy. But now with the second and a third virus wave and prolonged lockdowns again, the delays in the vaccine rollout, and also the variants of COVID that we still don't really know that much about, I think this is a lot less clear-cut that we are going back to the same potential that we fell from. And so this question, I think, really has major implication for how we perceive the role of the state as an investor, because if we think potential is ultimately unchanged, then the role of the state is basically to preserve that potential. And the way you do that is by freezing your economy, which is basically what everybody has been doing in 2020, and prioritizing very job-rich investment with high short-term multipliers that can also come through projects that already were in the pipeline. So they don't need to be groundbreaking, major restructuring of the economy. You can just keep doing what you were doing and do it faster, basically. But I think this is what probably Peter had in mind when thinking about the role of the state as an activist investor. So by freezing the economy, by taking stakes in those companies that you want to prevent from failing, you are effectively infiltrating the state in the economy, which then creates a question: how do you see this role going forward? But I think the second question is, if we think that instead there is a negative permanent effect on potential outputs, then the key question for public investment is how do you generate growth again? How do you move the economy up to a higher potential output growth? How do you recover what you basically lost during this shock? And this is basically the idea that's behind the RRF, so the Next Generation EU in Europe, and what we used to call, especially in Italy, the Recovery Fund, but it's also recovery and resilience. So that part is, I think, precisely pointing to this idea of restructuring and rebuilding something that can be more solid going forward. But that is really difficult. So there are not that many projects that you can think of that can lift potential outputs and shift the trajectory of growth that a country is on. And mostly those projects will have to do with pretty much what we have talked about in the Franken economy chapter. So deep restructuring of economic models, entire economic models that we are used to. And for this kind of projects, I think more than talking about activist investors, what we need the governments to become is venture capitalists, because it's the kind of investment that needs to be additional, clearly additional onto what the private sector could be incentivized even through incentives to do. It's going to be more risky because, of course, you are completely changing the face of your economy. So we're talking about massive reskilling, we're talking about deep digitalization, broad economic energy transition. This is even before getting into extreme things like space economy, which a lot of people are now starting to talk about. But I mean, it is really something that completely changes the face of the economy. So the risk associated to that kind of investment is much, much higher than the risk that the government will face in simply taking stakes in company to sort of keep them alive. And it also comes with a lot of different and perhaps less clearly financial implications. So what is the role of the state in promoting stakeholder capitalism at that point, for example, given this completely different shape that public investment is going to allow the economy to take? So this is, I think, the key distinction. So it's sort of going in the direction of what Guntram was saying between short-term and having a longer-term picture in mind. And I think so far, as speaking about fiscal policy and perhaps a bit about my own country, which is the one I know best, this being Italy, so far, I don't think that we are actually seeing that much of a venture capitalist approach on the side of governments, particularly, again, speaking of Italy, there's a lot of talk about the entrepreneurial state. So this idea of, which in its actually original conception is sort of going in that direction of the state becoming a venture capitalist, but in the political debate, very often means something very different and much closer to the kind of investment logic that I have discussed previously. So the short term taking stakes and preserving and freezing the economy idea. So I think that there's also this major shift in the way we perceive public investment that needs to happen for us to be able to really move forward and meet again, as as advocated by Guntram previously, which I agree with. And yeah, thank you. I think it's
well. Thank you, Silvia. Once again, I restrain myself. I think there are already a couple of questions. Carlo, can you pose the question through the chat, Carlo Altomonte, but you can, if you can speak up, that would be even better.
Yeah. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Pleasure to be here.
Ciao, Carlo. Please.
Ciao. So I'm Carlo Altomonte from Bocconi University and also M&M member. So my question is related to the transition phase. That is, how are we going to dismantle all the various, transition schemes, all the various state aid schemes, wage subsidy schemes, a moratorium on loans, grants, etc., we have put in place, and in what timing? Because we are all concentrating on the recovery and resilience facility, and we are all concentrating on where we see correctly the new equilibrium. But where the new equilibrium is going to be is also a function of the transition through which we go to this equilibrium. Because otherwise we repeat of making the same mistake we already did with the globalization adjustment to the China shock. We were trying to see where the China shock and the new global order would lead after liberalizing trade flows, and we forgot completely the reallocation phase. And that created, as we know, a number of problems in a number of countries that led to, populism and nationalist parties, etc., etc. So here, I think we shouldn't do the same mistake. There is a lot of emphasis on the next generation, again, correctly, but I think there is too little emphasis on the reallocation, on the transition phase. But getting it right in terms of reallocation, avoiding zombie companies on the other end, preventing too much layoffs and accompanying this transition with active labor market policies is going to be crucial, because productivity in the new world is going to be a function of this reallocation. So I hope I made myself clear.
Thank you, Carlo. From Carlo to Carlo, Carlo Stagnaro has a question. Please, Carlo, go ahead.
Yeah, my question is simply whether and how you think the EU Commission will have the authority, so to speak, and the enough political capital to invest in order to restore the competition policy that has been basically suspended in the past year and, well, in the past year and in the next few months. I'm thinking particularly, of course, about the temporary framework and the huge amount of state aid which has been handed out by several member states, but also I have in mind the weakness that the Commission has obviously had in the past few months in implementing merger controls and other measures. And this is particularly important, I think, as the states and as governments increase their stakes in formerly private companies, which creates a de facto situation of oligopolization, if not monopolization. Thank you.
Okay, I will. I think there is a lot on the. Well, here something is happening in my house. There are several issues on the table. I would, I would leave it perhaps Peter and Swa first, and then Guntram and Silvia.
Sure. Let me take the first question on the transition. I mean, the issue is very much on governments' minds. I mean, the finance minister here in the UK has openly talked about withdrawing support, and he keeps having to move it. But even in sort of slightly more, careful countries, there are government advisor. I was speaking to an Eurozone country, advisor to the Prime Minister, was saying they're having meetings. If this was 2 weeks ago, they're having meetings about how to withdraw support. It's on everybody's mind. It's really hard to implement it right now. The sort of things people have been talking about that I've spoken to have been things like being more targeted about who you decide is viable by looking at things like what was turnover pre-COVID versus now. We've had to move at speed because it just takes too long to filter out who wouldn't survive. So the money's been given to everybody, but this is on people's mind, and you have much more granular micrometrics of which firms get it. It's hard, I think, as Carlo, you pointed out, the expectation is there now that governments will be there to backstop. And there are a large number of jobs. The bankruptcy data, which has been put on hold, the bankruptcies were down in most G7 countries, I think, last year, hugely compared with 2019. And that's just a wave of bankruptcies going to come through. The hours work that have been lost, that shows how much work has actually just been put on ice, some of which will never come back. I think your point's very well made.
Yeah, I think just on the sort of state support side, I mean, I think the big question that most governments are really grappling with is what to do with all this, and banks as well are grappling with is what to do with all this support that's been provided to companies. And as I said, there's an element of sort of direct equity injections that have taken place, but also there's a lot of guaranteed debt that's been handed out that potentially is going to be through bankruptcy processes and restructurings and so forth for some businesses for whom the debt is unsustainable, will then be turned into equity and end up with the government. I think there's a debate about what to do at the smaller end, particularly with smaller companies where it really doesn't make any sense to have those kind of restructuring processes, and whether at some point governments will have to start forgiving debt, which would probably be the most sensible thing to do, but also quite contentious. But even if you can imagine a sort of governments ending up with these sort of kind of unwanted portfolios of equity investments, then the challenge really becomes, how do you manage that? You try and, there's been talk about sort of creating a sort of sovereign wealth fund or something, but I mean, the reality is that, these are not exactly kind of businesses with great prospects, and in some cases, almost by definition, the government is kind of the investor of last resort here. So how they manage that, I think, is going to be a big challenge, and sort of resisting political intervention. I mean, I think just to echo what Silvia was saying earlier, also that this idea of where states really should be getting involved is sort of at the very early stages, trying to stimulate investment and development of companies in new businesses and so forth. That we've seen relatively little of that, really, because I think partly because governments are so busy firefighting with some of the bigger companies.
I mean, perhaps I can add a few reflections. I mean, first of all, I think the transition issue is indeed a very fascinating and interesting, but it's also a very complicated one. I guess my first point would be, for the moment, I would keep ample and abundant support to the economy up and running, because currently we live in an economy that is severely constrained by public policy measures that essentially relate to the pandemic. So don't withdraw the support early. Keep the support for the moment. Having said that, as soon as supposedly we have some sort of herd immunity, and we can talk for a long time when that will be reached, and we can open up the economy, at that stage, the so-called transition will start. And I think then the really big question will be, what is our assumption about how quickly we will get to the new normal? And it's in function of that assumption that the support from the state can and should be gradually withdrawn. And let me just sort of, to make that a bit more explicit, let's just take, for example, the airline industry. I mean, if you think about the airline industry, we've talked about the future of work, and we all agreed here that a lot of future meetings will probably continue to be on Zoom and not on business travel. So I guess my gut feeling is that in the long-term equilibrium, we will have less business flights than we had pre-pandemic, but we will have certainly much more than currently. Now, where in between those two extremes will we land? We don't know at the moment. And so there will be this period of transition where, basically the support will be there, will have to be given, but will also have to be gradually withdrawn in function and in relation to what we think will be the future equilibrium. Now, then one further consideration in that respect is what about the kind of economy we want to have, right? I mean, as soon as you have so much public intervention, of course, there is also a political conversation that we need to have about what kind of economy do we want. Joe Biden calls this build back better, right? So there is clearly here sort of a message. We don't just want to build back, we want to build back better, right? So who defines what this better is? In the EU, of course, currently the debate and a lot of sort of the talking points around sort of a green economy, a digital economy. I mean, this is basically the priorities. But as you green the economy, well, then perhaps some sectors will deserve less support and an earlier withdrawal of support, especially in the transition period, than others. Very last point, and Carlos Zaniaro, you mentioned the state aid and competition regime. I mean, of course, I think also currently it is extremely important that the Commission looks at the biggest cases and avoids basically major distortions in the single market. And my understanding is that, of course, they do look at that. But of course, I agree with you, reintroducing tough state aid rules will be part of the whole equation and will have to happen. And there will have to be a political decision at what stage in that transition period will we have to go back to our normal state aid regime. So in sum, I guess I agree with Carlo Altamonte, I guess also because he's a Bruegel fellow, that basically we are in this period still now support, then transition, which will gradually be a period of gradual unwinding support, which will be really difficult, and where we really have to have a conversation and more research on how to unwind that support. Thank you.
Thank you, Guntram. Basically, we are learning, and this is a Bruegel webinar, right?
Yeah, I was about to say.
Silvia, sorry, before giving the floor back to you, Silvia, I would like to hear from Stefania on this competition and state aid point. Then we will give the floor to the macro guys.
Yeah.
And girls.
Thank you, Fabrizio, and thank you for giving me the floor for a minute. Just what we're talking about, which is the new normal, and I'm under the impression that we are in new normal now. We can't really talk about a transition when the period expands. The Commission is going to announce on Friday that the temporary framework will be extended to the end of December. The consultation has ended. So it will be more than 1.5 years, almost 2 years in December. It started in April. And that obviously will leave a mark on all the future rules of state aids and a longer transition period. So I think we will have to deal with this new normal or intermediate normal, waiting for some new normal that we really don't know when will start and what will be like. And if things go on like this, what really worries me is that we are discussing this as if getting to vaccine all the population in Europe will end the pandemic, which is not the case, because in this case, vaccines will go on every year. So it is a long-lasting and repeated exercise. It's not like flu, it's not like smallpox, it's not like other type of viruses. So every year we will go on with this idea of having to start again to vaccinate people. So I do not really feel that we will see a real new normal, let alone the normal. The old normal will not come back for very, well, significant number of years, to my understanding. So I'm not positive. I hear myself and say, well, let's really, my glass is not half full, it's just full, half empty, which is very unusual for me, but I don't have a very positive attitude this period.
Thank you, and I have two last questions, and from Francesco Gazzarelli and Carlalberto Maffè, and then the floor will be to you, Silvia. Please, Francesco, and then right after Carlo.
Thanks, Fabrizio, and thank you for these very thoughtful comments. I wanted to hear the panel's opinion on something I heard on a previous Zoom call. It's actually a Peterson Institute event where they presented the Geneva report, very, I think, central discussion around the interactions between monetary and fiscal policy. And among the discussants was Benoit Cœuré, and he mentioned, this is all on record, he said something about a possible resurgence of strains within Europe when the Commission will be asked to vet the plans, particularly those that come with reforms, and that may give rise to, again, tensions between member states and obviously with the Commission. So I just wanted to get a sense whether you think this is a correct observation, whether you anticipate tensions going forward, or particularly as we phase out of the pandemic acute phase and we go towards what we are discussing here, some notion of new normal, whatever that may be. Thanks.
Alberto.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Just a quick reminder on the fact that what really scares me and fascinates me is what happens at the microeconomic level. Is the nature of work, the nature of transaction, the transaction cost that is being intimidated by technology. Look at us, okay? I remember good old days when we would meet in front of a Prosecco glass of wine, possibly full empty, because we already drank it, okay? As a matter of fact, what I see is the reconfiguration of entrepreneurial organization. I think the striking fact of this last year has been the fact that the 5 top companies are data-driven organization, totally. And this explosion, this enormous explosion of data is the new organizational ingredient we need to figure out how to cope. I think that the miracle of this vaccine, a combination of biology and information technology, it's a symbolic element of what's going to be the next way to allocate capital, human capital and financial capital. And I'm absolutely positive about the reconfiguration of supply chains and the production of public goods as well. If anything, I've seen an unprecedented collaboration between the private sector and the public sector in the production of public goods in the form of public health. So I think that we shall restart, being being defeated from the liberal point of view by this triumphal march of public intervention, we shall reconstruct our troops starting from a microeconomic organization. And this will be a new era of science, a new era of transparency, a new era of accountability. I am bullish, my friends, and I stand my place. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Caro Alberto Carnevale Maffè. And Silvia, please, you have the last word.
So I will be brief, maybe someone else will jump in. I just wanted to take the question on potential tensions, fiscal monetary commission. But I wanted to start from actually something that we discussed in the previous round, which is state aid and how that is going to change. Not that much how that is going to change, but I think something that's not come up yet is how so far, on top of having had this huge wave of state aid in quantity, there's also been an asymmetry in terms both of the geographical allocation of that state aid and also the form that the state aid has taken across borders in different countries. So we know there's some countries have been resorting more to equity injections, which is equivalent to bearing the cost of the operation instantly, and other countries have resorted way more to guarantees, which is basically a way to try and delay the cost, but it's also creating a lot of uncertainty as to the extent that this will turn into fiscal liabilities going forward. Why am I saying this? Why I think it's important? I think it's important because basically this risk to further reinforce the asymmetry that we are already seeing in terms of impact on public finances and potential impact on the recovery across Europe. I mean, if you look at the public debt forecast at the end of 2020, according to the European Commission, you have some countries that, despite the huge fiscal stimulus implemented, like Germany, will still have debt to GDP very low, below 100%, below 90%, as a matter of fact, and countries like Italy that will reach 160. So this clearly creates a huge gap between within the Eurozone, and the question is how to reconcile that going forward, which is why I think that the key question on the fiscal side, the key discussion on the fiscal side, will be one about the fiscal rules at the European level. So when should those fiscal rules be restarted? They're currently frozen, and when they will be restarted, what form should they take? How should all that debt, that different kind of debt, be accounted for the purpose of EU fiscal policy and for the purpose of long-term fiscal sustainability, which we know right now is not a problem because the environment is beneficial, but at the same time, this is not something that we can take for granted going forward, which is where the question of monetary fiscal relationships in Europe comes in. And I think if you compare to the US, it's quite clear that Europe still has not made up its mind as to how this is going to work. But will be the key question for, I would say, the coming years.
Fabrizio, can I add one point?
Sure, exactly. I was just asking you, please.
No, I wanted to sort of bring together the last two questions, which one was on sort of the reform conditionality, or however you want to call that. And then there was the question of the micro and rebuilding from the micro. And I mean, of course, some of you have seen, I'm sure, the reports about lack of reform interest in the country that I know best. So in Germany, where basically the Commission has now complained towards the member state, towards Germany, that what they propose in reforms is actually quite limited. Now here, I actually agree that there's way too little reform in Germany. Unfortunately, the Commission asked for the wrong kind of reform. They asked for pension reform instead of asking for a rapid digitalization of the public administration, which I think hearing the last question, is one of the key issues. I mean, the value creation is with data and with digitalization, and we need to rebuild our economies also from that. So really, I think we need to all put a much more emphasis when thinking about how this money can be used to leverage our economy for the next economy, on digitalization, on climate, on making sure that, you know, we rebuild a new kind of economy. And that's certainly the case for Germany, but I'm sure there's other countries that would benefit from more investments in that space. Thank you.
Very good point. Very good point, Guntram. Indeed, sometimes we do have not necessarily the most, you know, the most appropriate requests also from the European side. I will stop here, and it's just my task to congratulate everybody and to thank everybody, and particularly Swaha, Peter, Silvia, and Guntram, and to give the floor to Rob for the second part of the webinar, the one devoted to the future of cities. Rob, will you introduce our guests and speakers? You're on mute.
Sorry, Fabrizio, I was listening to your instructions to mute my phone so you wouldn't hear me spilling my tea here. But no, great, that was a fantastic discussion. And appreciate everybody's interventions, and thanks to my colleagues Swaha and Peter. We're going to take a little bit of a quick tack here and think about the future of cities. We should have on the line, as it were, our interlocutors. There's Monica. Hi, Monica. Do we have the mayor?
Yes. Hi.
Hi. Greetings. And do we have do we have the architect, an urban planner? All right. Well, I'm going to introduce everybody. So welcome. And so our first, as you can see, Kostas is there. Kostas Bakoyannis is the mayor of Athens. Kostas and I met in St. Moritz recently. I was really impressed with his discussion and the way he discussed and talked about his city. He comes from a long line of Greek politicians and public servants. So thank you again, Kostas, for joining us. Stefano Boeri is a renowned Italian architect whose Bosco Verticale is the first structure in Milan, I think, to give the Duomo competition in 450 years, and whose Primrose vaccination pavilions, which I haven't seen them, but they represent hope for the end of the pandemic. A really fantastic piece of public art and architecture. And then Monica Frassoni is a former Green Party legislator who's now the president of the European Alliance to Save Energy. Let me just start by sort of give a kind of a big picture here. My city, New York City, there's a study that came out that cited smartphone location data and estimated that about almost 500,000 people had left New York City between March, when the first stay-at-home orders were first implemented by the governor, and then May. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, there is an estimate that some 700,000 foreign-born residents may have left the city of London alone. This comes at a time when we actually have seen, apart from some mega cities, we have seen the share of population living in cities declining, with some exceptions in Europe. I think Vienna was one, and actually London and Milan. But I'm just curious, I'm going to start with you, Mayor. How worried are you that the shift towards working from home, as it's smart working, as it's called, particularly in Italy, and away from cities, you know, that it's really kind of occurred during the pandemic, it's become, you know, our new normal. Are you worried that that will become permanent, and what's that mean for a city like Athens?
Well, good evening. Thank you so much for the invitation, Rob. It's a true pleasure to be with you tonight. Greetings from Athens, everybody. Well, you know, what comes to mind is this, I think, famous quote by Mark Twain. I think he got a letter once upon a time asking him whether he's dead. And he replied that, you know, the reports of my death are greatly exaggerated. I think the same quote can be applied to all these articles I've been reading for the past few months, which are more or less describing the death of the city. We all know that cities are absolutely intertwined with human history. I mean, cities are the epicenters of human culture and human civilization. And this is, of course, coming from the city of Athens, that's proud to be the cradle of democracy. Having said that, we are living through an extraordinary time. That is true. But if one looks back to history, it's very clear that pandemics have actually helped cities evolve. I mean, you know, the most famous example is the Black Death and how the Renaissance followed the Black Death. But also, if you look back to the 1818 or 1819 pandemic, you'll see that it led to the Gilded Age and to the Empire State Building that was built in 1930. But of course, at the end of the day, it's all up to us. It's up to the policymakers and it's up to society. What I'm trying to say is that we're actually living through a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to actually change our cities, towards the better. Not just to play defense, which means that we have to build our resilience and prepare for more crises in the future, but at the same time, to be aggressive in terms of A, reclaiming and redistributing public space, B, building new mobility models, C, making sure that we protect the identity of our cities, the DNA of our cities, meaning mixed zoning and mixed land use. So overall, if I had to put one title, I'd say that this is not about bouncing back, this is about bouncing forward.
And I mean, just maybe explain a little bit about what's been the experience with Athens. In the start of the pandemic, Greece did quite a good job. It would seem to be, you know, one of the exemplary nations. Europe, but of course, like everywhere, that the thing doesn't really care about borders, and it doesn't really care about political parties or anything like that. What is the state of play right now?
Well, from the very beginning, the state was very decisive. We actually put truth, transparency, and facts over politics and partisanship. I think that has helped us tremendously. At the same time, Greek society, I don't know how many of you have visited Greece. You may know that Greeks are not the most disciplined lot, but Greek society has been very mature. And overall, I think we have had a fairly satisfactory track record so far. But having said that, clearly, this is not just a public health crisis. This is also an economic crisis, and this is also a social crisis. It hit us at a particularly cruel time, just as we were coming out of another crisis, of a financial crisis of 10 years, just as we were, you know, looking at the future with a newly found sense of confidence and optimism. But moving forward, I think it's important that the social contract between the state and its citizens has actually borne fruit. And since, as we all know, we're all in a global race. I mean, cities are in a global race right now as we speak. It's a global race for 3 prizes: for investment, for tourism, for talent. I think the record of managing this crisis actually creates a more solid basis for the future.
Right. Thank you, Mayor. Let me ask you, Stefano. I mean, how worried are you about the shift away from, you know, do you think it's temporary, the way we've moved away from cities and we've lost lots of the vitality as a result of, you know, the urge to social distance or the requirement to social distance? Are you worried that that urban centers are going to be, you know, permanently changed in some negative way? I don't know, do we have Stefano on?
I'm sorry. So what
I believe, sorry, no problem.
Yeah, sir. What I believe is that this pandemic probably will not create a condition of, let's say, revolution and urban processes and social behaviors, but it will for sure accelerate some trends that were already happening in our urban universe. One of this is for sure this, let's say, opportunity to imagine that our huge metropolitan environment should become more similar to the concept of, let's say, an archipelago of self-sufficient districts. And that's a very, very, very important, crucial issue. So we have probably to imagine that a certain paradigm of city was founded 200 years ago, which was city was based on the capacity of a small number of big epicenters that were attracting, let's say, flows of people for that. So this paradigm is going to probably disappear. And what we have to do is to imagine a new condition where in every district, we have this slogan of a 15 million city that's now, let's say, used in Paris, in London, in Barcelona, in Milano, has a probable ticket to win. But I believe that this concept of a district where you can find all what you need in terms of commercial utilities, schools, health system, you know, how we let's say, instead of this opportunity in a period of pandemics in Italy, for instance, in 15 minutes walking or bike. It's a way to try to, let's say, in a certain way to answer to the counterpoint of this necessity of, let's say, imagining a new proximity that the pandemic is asking you to do. So I believe that if city wants to, let's say, to be resilient and to try to answer to trends that were already on the road, ongoing before the crisis, we have to do some, let's say, very important and urgent change. And one is that. Another is that probably, well, if I think to Europe, so the risk is to go back to what's happened in the 80s with this, let's say, sprawl. So this, let's say this fact is the delocalization was changing the European environment, creating this kind of, let's say, diffuse city that were, let's say, blurring the border of the cities and creating a multitude of small buildings everywhere. And so what I believe is that in Europe, for instance, but in a certain way also in other parts of the world, we have to invest on the heritage of the system of a network of historical and rural villages that are the interior areas that are, I think, in condition to let's say, receive this possible trends towards abandonment of cities. And I believe we have to avoid in any case to, let's say, go back to this process of sprawl who was so tremendous bad for our landscape. So one answer is to make cities more capable to give the sense of community, avoiding phenomenon of congestion. And on the other side, we have probably to make this network of small rural historical villages capable to rebirth, to start again.
So Monica, I want to bring you in here. I mean, if there's an opportunity as well, as Stefano says, to sort of rethink urban centers, and as the mayor says, they ain't going away. But at each time we've had these challenges, whether it was the Black Death or the Spanish flu, you know, where you've had these rejuvenation of cities, and they are not like Mark Twain. They have not. Their death is exaggerated, greatly exaggerated. What is this now the moment then to sort of also align this with some of the goals that so many governments have embraced, including my government recently? There was a little change. I don't know if you saw regime there, but on sort of green transition, you know, this end of the hydrocarbons era. Is this that sort of moment you can bring these two together? What's your perspective on that?
Well, I think that, good evening, everyone. Buonasera a tutti. Thank you and very much for the invitation, first of all, and I'm very glad to share this panel with Mr. Boeri and the mayor of Athens, a city that I really love very much. Well, I would say that we are really lucky because the fact of adjusting and of taking all necessary measures to accompany the green transition and in general to mitigate and adapt to climate change are also those measures that will help us to make the cities more livable, less polluted, more clean, and our houses better isolated and also more comfortable. So I think that we need actually to link the urgency of the green transition with also the fact that the organization of what people want today is very much in line with this choice. Of course, we have to make sure that there are public and private investment ready to make sure that these new services or this new idea of city is actually affordable for everyone, because it is wonderful that we can all live in our house that can be easily transformed in an office if you are living in a beautiful environment. But if you are packed in a condo with really very, very little energy or light or whatever, this becomes much more difficult. So I think that in this very moment, the possibility of linking the quality and of services, and we can even talk about a green welfare with a design of city which is also more beautiful, more comfortable, and goes in the direction that both the mayor and Mr. Boeri said, is really the challenge, and also the only possibility that we have today. Also because take into account that as far as the European Union is concerned, I was really fascinated by this idea of Bauhaus. You know, it is this idea that was launched by the European Commission, probably to dress in a beautiful and fancy way all the policies around the renovation wave, the directive on energy efficiency, the improvement of building standards, etc., which in themselves can be considered to be pretty dry. But the idea of saying, okay, in order to accompany this, you also need a big creative push is something that is fascinating, and not only for architects, but also for policymakers.
Let me pick up on that actually with the mayor. I'd just sort of be interested to know what lessons you might have learned. Like if you could snap your fingers, and I know it's not that easy, no mayor quite has that power and to make a wish, but if you could change some things based on what you've learned, whether it was the way people respond to the pandemic or the way that we think, or the epidemiologists have told us the disease spreads, what would you do to just take a picture of Athens and sort of what would you change, whether it's through the public transportation system, the layout? Obviously, you're not going to move the Acropolis. I wouldn't suggest that. It's one of the best possible hill you could find. But what would you do differently?
Well, I would absolutely love to have a magic wand. And I'm sure that plenty of Athenians would love us to have magic wands, but I'm afraid that's not the case. What I can say is what we actually did during the past few months. We truly thought, and we still do, that this is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. So we actually engaged on a major project called the Great Walk of Athens. The idea is to reunify our archaeological sites and change the city center. It's a project that's based on a new understanding of sustainable mobility, full respect to cars, but I think their time has passed. This is not just about respecting the rights of the driver, but also the rights of pedestrians, cyclists, and of course, passengers of mass transit. And at the same time, what we attempted to do was actually liberate public spaces. Now, this shouldn't really come as a shock to anyone. I mean, to use a famous example, the New York Central Park was the response to another public health crisis back in the day. So yes, this has been an extremely challenging time. Yes, we would all love to be wizards, but I think we have all grown wiser from this experience. and that we certainly can look at the future much more with a much more open mind.
Yeah, sure. Stefano, if you had the mayor could give you a magic wand, or you could work together and come up with some ideas to make Athens, or just take that blueprint to any great city, Milan, Zurich, Rome. What would you like to see? Now we know that we're constrained by we've got a pandemic to fight. There's so many other priorities in terms of public spending. But I'd be curious to know what kind of things you would do if you had a magic wand.
Well, I believe that an important issue is all what we can do in order to make our city greener. And from that point of view, I just want to, let's say, introduce an issue which is about the sense of fragility that this pandemic has. Well, let's say it's like a pervasive heritage, of this pandemic condition. And I think that this is something that we have to know how to accept and deal with. And probably this fragility tells us that from one side, the size of the phenomenon that we don't know, or phenomenon that we don't know, has expanded enormously. But we have also that we have to probably to change or to stop our aggressive, let's say, controlling relationship with nature. And I believe that if we seriously think to this fragility, what we have understood is that nature is no longer just what we think the outside should be, outside the city, outside the homes, even outside our own bodies. So nature has proved to be fundamentally integral with the life of our species. And one small virus has managed to establish a frightening fast system of osmosis between all the individuals of our species on the planet. So I think we have to first somehow to rethink our idea of cities and metropolis in a completely different scenario. And from that point of view, all what we are going to do in Europe, and not only in Europe, is the idea of forestation, urban forestry. It's in my opinion, absolutely urgent and crucial. Well, nature helps us because it cleans the air from fine, or let's say, polluted air in our urban environment. But at the same time, it's transform already produced CO2 into oxygen, reduce heat, increase biodiversity. So it's an amazing support to improve our life in the urban environment. So there are many ways to do that. One is to create, let's say, orbital forest. Another is to multiply the number of green roofs, or to create, let's say, vertical forest, or to intervene in the existing facade, make them greener. But that's something that we have to do. And I believe that urban forestation is probably the most, let's say, efficient, the less expensive, and the most inclusive way to try to, let's say, tackle down climate change and global warming in our cities.
I'm going to ask you, Monica. I mean, the mayor said also, he referred sort of an apologies to the automobile. But I don't know. I was in London just weeks before the lockdowns hit, and I remember sitting in the tube thinking, this doesn't feel like the right place to be in the middle of a pandemic. And if you look at ridership in New York City and other big cities where you really have to take the public transportation, I mean, how are we going to? And you hear these stories like Paris now has got as much traffic coming into Paris every day as it did before, even though people aren't going to the office. It's because they're not taking the RER or whatever, the metro. How do we get back to sort of a greener public transportation system, or how do we convince people that it's actually safe to take the tube or the metro?
Well, first of all, let me say that I really do hope that this pandemic is temporary, and therefore that this is not going to last forever, or it lasts in a permanent, something that is not really permanent. So in terms of making public transport more secure, this is certainly a challenge. But I live in Brussels, and the administration here, which is very complicated because it has 19 little cities in the same region, and each of them has got a different policy in terms of urbanism and in terms of mobility up to a certain extent. But here there are some attempts that are done in terms of mobility in order to encourage very much people, for example, to take the bike. And I was really very much impressed by the fact that the combination of the pandemic and a very, very voluntaristic administration really tripled in a matter of months the amount of cycling, of pisciclable. I have a moment of amnesia of how you say this in English. I'm sorry. And of course, people are going in on public transport. They are wearing all their masks, etc., etc. So there is still people who are taking a lot of train and of metro and buses, etc. But the fact of promoting and organizing different kinds of individual mobility is not impossible, even in a rainy city and even in very short time. So I would say that this is certainly a way. I also think that the question of the link to a different organization of your own life, the fact that you work more from home, that you don't need to commute so much, that you commute only if, for example, you want to go to the movie, to the theater, or you want to go to see the Acropolis, is also something that is probably going to go in the direction of a greener city. But I would like to insist on the role of those who are in government, really, to help these choices, and the importance of putting the investments where the needs are. And, there is a lot of discussion, for example, in my country, Italy, in this sense, about the role of infrastructure or the role of investment, in orientating the kind of society we want. And here again, the role of cities and the priority of investing in city is probably much more important than to choose for high-speed trains where they are not needed, or for big infrastructure because apparently they bring jobs. So I believe that this is something to be thought, and I believe that in some countries what is really lacking is the capacity of anticipating, of sitting down with architects, artists, policymakers, industrial, civil society, and say, okay, what is the city I want to have in the future? And probably now is exactly the time where we need all those people to tell us what is the direction that we have to go, taking, of course, into account the urgency of managing climate change, but also being able to organize ourselves in the middle of a pandemic. But I really believe very much in the capacity of orientation, of regulation, investment, and orientation also of the behavior of people. And if I may, I want to add, another point that for me is very important that Mr. Boeri also mentioned earlier, and that is the link not only with nature, but also with what is outside the city. I mean, the capacity of linking the fact that the city is not just, a bubble in the middle of nowhere. It is something that is linked to a lot of elements around it. And this capacity in terms, for example, of food production, in terms of leisure, in terms of industrial production, because you don't have industries in the middle of the city, of course. But all of these are really very important. And I come from Brescia, which is a city which has been designated a couple of days ago as the most polluted, or the city with the worst air in Europe. And I must tell you that one of the most important challenges that that city, but also others, will have to face is how to deal with pollution that does not come from the city, which is the case actually in Brescia, because it is very much polluted by industries which are around, and also agriculture, which is very intensive over there. So the issue of the quality of air or the quality of life in cities also be very much dependent from what happens around.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I sort of pick up on what you mentioned, regulation. I think that's one of the things that certainly when you hear about the renovation or the rejuvenation of cities or any infrastructure, there's so much difficulty. I mean, Mayor, I'd love to get your perspective. How do you as a politician balance, well, let's say regulation. I want to think about constituencies. So on the one hand, you are in, as you said, the cradle of democracy, and you've got ruins probably everywhere you look. You dig anywhere in Athens, you're liable to find, a column or something. It's not unlike Rome. How difficult does that make your job? But and I want to sort of a second point. You talked, Monica talked about people outside of cities. I asked this question about cars. If we decide that cars can't come in, doesn't that mean we're sort of punishing the poorer people, the people who live outside of cities, who depend on coming into the cities every day and have no other way? I don't know, plumbers, whatever it might be, workmen. How do you balance these constituencies? And is that going to be the impediment, the biggest impediment, aside from maybe having the ability to just, conjure up money to make things happen?
Well, to be 100% transparent, it's tough. It's a tough challenge, because at the end of the day, like much everything in life, it's about actually being able to find a balance. Now, let me just make a quick parenthesis and say the following. Those of us who are lucky enough to live in historical cities, we know that there is no homogeneous urban planning, right? It's not about starting with Brasilia and starting from the scratch. It's about actually making sure that there is a fundamental respect for the history of the city through the ages. And it's actually about understanding that cities are living organisms, that they may well have their surprises, they may well have their contradictions, and it's about unifying rather than dividing. So at the end of the day, each project has a story of its own, much like each city has a story of its own. And of course, there may well be a project that's too big, but there is no project that's too small. I mean, we recently began in Athens with pocket parks to make sure that we're able to get more green and more oxygen to our neighborhoods. Now, it may not sound important enough to mention in such a setting, but believe me, it's important enough for the quality of life of a number of neighborhoods. Having said that, when we talk about cars, again, it's about finding a balance. We cannot go from one extreme to the other, and especially not in the case of Athens, which because of the financial crisis has lost precious time compared to other cities. But we have to be very, very clear about the end goal and the end game. I mean, cities are functioning for their residents, but they're also functioning for those who work there. They're functioning for the visitors, for the tourists. And we need to be very clear about the targets we set, even if these are long-term targets.
We have an intervention, or Manfredi Catella, who runs Coima, the property developer in Milan. Manfredi, you want to take the floor? You had some comments you wanted to make?
Well, very, very short, maybe some questions than more than comments. Maybe just one single comment with the experience on the ground. I think that ultimately the pandemic I don't think it will change substantially the matter of cities rather digitalization that we all live has made clear that we can be a little bit more flexible in our habit, and that is to stay, and has cleaned the agenda of priorities of all of us, which is pretty basic, which is about climate change and is about social inclusion and upgrading the infrastructure in a way which is not anymore just marketing, but is a real priority for a number of reasons. So in a way made the agenda very clean and clear for everyone, either public or private sector. And ultimately, I think from this perspective, the pandemic has been very positive. So there's two questions. One for the mayor is what doesn't make you make you awake at night, if anything? And to both Stefano and the mayor, if you can, or to the three of you, if you would have a piece of the recovery fund, which is substantial, so call it whatever substantial means for you, 10 billion, where would you invest it?
You want to go first, Mayor?
Well, what keeps me awake at night? Well, it's a character fault. Not much keeps me awake at night, but I do have this anxiety. I must admit to that. I do have an anxiety that this is a race against time. Things are changing very, very quickly. I understand that there is this sense that suddenly, once we will suddenly go back to normal, and it's going to be like going back to the future, back to February 2020. That's not my sense. I think it's not about, waking from a hibernation. A lot has changed over this past months. The last few months have been really catalytic. And things have changed very quickly, especially when it comes to technology, but also when it comes to how people come to terms with their environments. So I think the duty for all of us policymakers is not to lose any more precious time. What would I do with the funds? Tons of things. We already have a master plan that we are actually implementing stage by stage. There are a number of projects, but what actually heartens me is that a number of these projects are actually implemented through the cooperation with the private sector. What we're seeing in Athens right now is that the public and the private sector work together harmoniously for the first time. We have a program called Adopt Your City, and there are already a number of tangible and visible results on the ground.
And Monica, what would you do with the money? Or we'll go to you, Stefano. What would you do with the money?
Well, no, well, just to add another issue, I believe I will probably invest it in a digital democracy. So we didn't discuss about concept of smart cities, but well, for sure the use of algorithms and artificial intelligence, it's certainly a giant step in the metropolis vision of the future. But I believe that the real great challenge of smart cities, however, will be that of digital democracy. So in other words, it will be essential to guarantee all citizens not only the access to big data, but also the possibility of managing them in relation to their needs. So I seriously think it's a very, 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 very important nowadays.
And Monica, what would you do with the magic?
Well, considering that with this pandemic, a lot of people had to stay at home a lot. and that about 40% of the emissions is due to buildings, I would invest massively in the renovation of buildings. You know, the European Union and also governments, the Italian, but not only the Italian one, is going to put a lot of money in there. My worry is that it is well done, because, you know, you can make renovation in a terrifying way. Yeah. And I think that the quality of the projects and the way in which you spend the money is going to be even more important than the amount of the money given. So I would definitely do that. And you know, at the moment in Italy, there is a renovation rate of about 0.4. In Europe is about 1% per year. And in order to respect our targets, we should triple this rate. And if, by the way, would make the cities more beautiful, it would be even better.
Okay, well, thank you. I think we'll wrap it up here. We said 7:30, we're 3 minutes over. I want to thank you. Grazie, Monica and Stefano. Evcharisto, Mayor.
Thank you so much.
I'll pass it now to Fabrizio to close things.
Well, thank you, Rob. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Stefano. Thank you, Kostas. Thank you also to the previous speakers and everybody. I think you will hear from M&M very soon. And let me take the cue from what just Monica said. We need indeed a very effective and efficient policy in action and public policies. Thank you.
Grazie.